that we're streaming as soon as the streaming is working.
I'm looking for Jessica to... Are we live? Okay.
Grand.
Well, good afternoon. Welcome everyone to ODI. This afternoon we have the privilege of experiencing the launch of ALNAP's most recent paper on the humanitarian clusters. Obviously, we'd like to perhaps acknowledge ODI for hosting this event, and obviously ALNAP for all the hard work that's gone into it. Just a brief introduction for those who, myself and those sitting around me. My name is Saunders. I'm the Global Shelter Cluster Coordinator on behalf of the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, or IFRC. To my right and to my left, firstly I have Paul Knox-Clarke,
Hello.
the
Hi.
Head of Research, United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And to my extreme left, I have Gerbrand Alkema, who is the Health Cluster Support Expert, but currently sitting with Save the Children. I think given the fact that we have obviously quite a meaty topic, I would actually like to move straight into discussing, the subject matter. Now, I'm conscious that probably in the room and online, I must welcome our online audience as well. I'm conscious that we probably have quite a mix of people who are perhaps very familiar with the humanitarian clusters and the humanitarian reform process, and maybe some people who are perhaps a little less familiar or perhaps have been engaged a little bit more recently. So I think I'll just, if you don't mind, take the liberty of perhaps providing a little bit of background to the subject. I mean, the cluster approach is a component of the humanitarian reform process, which was launched a decade ago, and actually it scares me to think it's been a decade. That process was initiated by the then United Nations Emergency Relief Coordinator, Jan Egeland. Although it was initiated by the UN, in fact, the reform itself, the reform process and the review was actually undertaken by a diverse group of individuals, which came up with a number of recommendations for the ISC. So although it's often been, rightly or wrongly perceived as a UN process, it has been interagency based. And for example, one of the members of that initial review team was a senior official from the Red Cross Red Crescent organisation. Now that review came out with 4 key recommendations to improve the effectiveness of humanitarian response. The cluster approach was one of those 4 recommendations. It was specifically, and I'll quote here from that document, it was aimed at improving the effectiveness of humanitarian response by ensuring greater predictability and accountability, while at the same time strengthening partnerships between NGOs, international organizations, the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, and UN agencies. Now, the other 3 recommendations, and they were clearly all meant to be complementary, were as follows. 1 was to ensure there was adequate, timely, and flexible humanitarian financing. The second one was to improve humanitarian coordination and leadership, and that was explicitly at the top of the tree at country level in terms of the humanitarian coordinators, the resident coordinators, and in terms of the leadership was being provided at that level for the humanitarian community. And thirdly, the other key recommendation was that there was to be more effective partnerships between the UN and non-humanitarian actors. And I have to say, I always had a bit of an issue that it's about UN and non-UN, and I've, of course, somewhat flippantly with my Red Cross colleagues talked about what about between Red Cross, Red Crescent and non-Red Cross, Red Crescent. But partnerships was a key component, and at the time, the UN system, I think it was UNOCHA, actually put out a very interesting little diagram, which had the kind of 3 pillars around the cluster approach, humanitarian financing, and leadership from the humanitarian coordinators on a platform of partnership. So these were meant to be all interlinked. So perhaps hold that thought when we then hear a little bit more about the findings to see to what extent some of those other recommendations have or have not, impacted on the cluster approach. Now, drilling down on the cluster approach itself, because that phrase, I'm conscious I'm using it, and again, it may not necessarily be fully apparent to all of you exactly what it is, or perhaps just to go back to basics. In 2006, the ISC produced a guidance note. Now, the Interagency Standing Committee It's all the UN agencies who are members, standing invitees, including the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, and the representative bodies of the NGOs, produced a guidance note to define what this cluster approach was about. Now, I'll just quote the two parts because I think this is crucial in terms of what it is we're talking about. At the global level, and I quote, the global level, the aim of the cluster approach is to strengthen system-wide preparedness and technical capacity to respond to humanitarian emergencies by ensuring that there is predictable leadership and accountability in all the main areas or sectors of humanitarian response. That's the global level. At country level, the aim is to strengthen humanitarian response by demanding high standards of predictability, accountability, and partnership in all sectors or areas of activity. It is about achieving more strategic responses and better prioritization of available resources by clarifying the division of labor among organizations, better defining the roles and responsibilities of humanitarian organizations within the sectors, and providing the humanitarian coordinator with both a first point of call and a provider of last resort in all the key areas or sectors of activity. So that is what the cluster approach is supposed to deliver. Now, of course, as I mentioned, in terms of my title as Global Shelter Cluster Coordinator, I'm not unbiased on this. So as a disclaimer, clearly I have been heavily involved. In fact, perhaps to counterbalance that, I've been involved for the decade, actually, which again is a bit concerning. Initially as the sole NGO representative in the shelter cluster, and then when IFRC took on its leadership role as the coordinator. So in some ways, I've been both sort of sides of the table, obviously more recently as the coordinator. So yeah, I have some views, but obviously we're here to hear from about the report and, of course, for comments from our panelists and others. But I would actually like to, in some ways, take advantage of being chair and just, make a couple of observations just to kind of, stir up the conversation and perhaps set the scene for Paul and Leah. I mean, firstly, in terms of, why I even perhaps agreed to do this and why I'm still in this cluster coordination role. I mean, as a practitioner, and which is first and foremost my role, I have to say, I spent sort of 20 years in humanitarian action, and I'm an architect, I come from the private sector. Now, I have to say those first 10 years, and it's probably mirrored with a number of people, certainly those who perhaps over more of my age range, that humanitarian action, before the cluster approach, was perhaps, less than what it could have been. I witnessed a huge lack of coordination amongst humanitarian agencies and bigger emergencies, and of course all the resulting inefficiencies, duplications, inconsistencies. Since the cluster approach has been there, certainly it's not necessarily solved all the problems, but certainly, I have witnessed firsthand far greater coherence, collaboration, and an improved impact of humanitarian action. Again, which is why I'm still in this role and why I'm obviously very interested in this paper and obviously to be with you today. Of course, this is not the first time the cluster approach has been reviewed. The Interagency Standing Committee commissioned 2 evaluations, most recently in 2009, and most global clusters have commissioned their own reviews. The whole move towards real-time evaluations obviously has thrown up an awful lot more current information, and even for those who are familiar, the operational peer reviews, which one of the new components of the transformative agenda, have actually brought in, again, a degree of analysis, while things are happening, which of course includes the cluster. So we have a lot more information to go on. Again, primarily major emergencies, not the small ones. However, since the last IASC review in 2009, there's not been one overarching review to look at the cluster approach as a whole. It's always been little bite-sized chunks. So actually, this review is quite timely. Again, it's been 6 years without something that's, all embracing. So what can this review add? I just throw out, perhaps a couple of questions on this in terms of the what. Well, a lot of those reviews, and again, this is personal opinion here, of course, have tended to focus on what people thought the clusters should do, not necessarily what they actually are doing. So actually, this current review, and from obviously having seen the earlier draft, I actually really welcome the fact it's actually gone and saw what the clusters are doing, rather than going back to a little generic terms of reference and said, well, what are they doing on this? It's not a scorecard issue. It's in what's the impact in the field. So I think that's refreshingly different. And of course, I know hopefully we'll hear a bit more from Paul and Leah on this, but actually looking at the differences between the different clusters and the different... So it's basically disaggregating this thing we call coordination. In terms, why now? Why is it relevant now? Well, of course, as many of you know, we're in the midst of this process leading up to the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul next May. It is this opportunity to reflect upon humanitarian action and how it's working. In fact, a number of us in this room were recently in New York for another ALNAP convened event to actually discuss and analyse, what could or should the shape of humanitarian action be like in the future. So this review is really quite timely. Now, just before I hand over to Paul, three perhaps quick observations, from myself, which again, it'll be interesting to see to which the review, touches on, because I suppose they're quite big issues for me. I mean, firstly, as I regularly remind participants at our annual Global Shelter Cluster meeting, the clusters, quite uniquely, are the highest level sectoral platform where representatives from what we call the three pillars of humanitarian action, the United Nations agencies, the NGOs, and the Red Cross, Red Crescent system, are mandated to sit down together. Now, that may sound like, well, so what, if you're sitting in the private sector or, you're just a member of the general public. But, given the different mandates of those organisations, that is a big step. So it means that people are empowered to sit and discuss, regardless of your identity, which actually, again, is quite new. We have lots of sector forums and events and meetings, but everyone's flying their own flag. It's a unique platform where effectively we are mandated to sit down and do business together. That's really quite positive, again, quite unique. And then given the challenges of all those mandates, different mandates, the sheer rise in the number of humanitarian actors, it's a precious opportunity to harness this wide-ranging collective expertise and know-how. Personally, I think it would be far poorer without that opportunity. Secondly, I would like to, in some ways, paraphrase the comments that were made by the Director General of ECHO, Klaus Sorensen, at this meeting. Again, a number of us were at in New York the week before last. He was giving the keynote speech on the second day, and in a fairly sort of direct way. I don't remember the exact comments, but again, so paraphrasing him, he made reference to the fact that don't scrap the clusters, because they may not be perfect, and clearly they need to be improved, but they are definitely preferable to, and this was his word, the fluffy alternatives. So I made a note of that word, fluffy. So again, it'd be interesting to hear from Paul and Leah the extent to which the review also looked at, alternatives and how fluffy or not they are. And lastly, again, with my hat on as Global Cluster Coordinator, as you can imagine, I, on a regular basis, as many other people involved in clusters, and I'm sure Laurie does likewise, receive a whole series of kind of comments, sometimes good, sometimes not so good, various critiques either from agencies or individual emails about what we could or should not be doing. We seem to be sort of easy targets for, well, why can't you go and sort this out? Which is fine, okay, that comes with the job. However, and we were talking about this just before the panel began, I think what has been interesting to note, and it's kind of dawned on me, and perhaps it's blindingly obvious to you, but it's interesting that that word cluster in some ways has almost become shorthand for the whole humanitarian system. It's a very easy thing to say, well, why is not great ability to affected populations? Go on, clusters, do something. I'm like, well, we're not legal entities. We have absolutely zero authority over any agency. An agency can walk into a room and walk away. They do not have to speak to the clusters whatsoever. How can we ensure accountability? The question really is, what are operational agencies doing about accountability to affected populations? The issue is about what are donors doing. So at the moment we have this obviously a very fragmented system, with the mandates, etc. So in some ways to say, well, the clusters are not doing this, in some ways is again, I don't, just get me wrong, I don't see this as necessarily a bad thing, but I think in some ways it's a lens to look through at, what is the criticism of the humanitarian system? In other words, yes, the clusters are part of that, but we're not the totality of the humanitarian system. So it's a useful lens. And so in some ways, I think of all those various emails and comments as actually quite a good sort of repository of comments about the humanitarian system. And obviously I do, send them out to others to say, well, this is something for you, with it being my own organisation or to UNOCHA or others. I'll pick on this one issue around accountability. Big issue, certainly in the last few years, a key component of the transformative agenda, huge pressure on accountability. And I know John has been part of these conversations for some time now. However, at the moment, there is almost negligible accountability between agencies. There is negligible accountability between donors, and there's almost negligible accountability between states, whether it be an affected state or a state who's responding in support of them. This thing of collective accountability, it is a challenge, and I remember being in a meeting several years ago where John, articulated some of, the dilemmas. It's almost one of the biggest challenges. But, I think we use this word accountability far too flippantly. And again, the clusters are quite a good example of the extent to which there's this perhaps misperception that is a vehicle around accountability. Again, I think it's an important thing. Let's perhaps look through the lens of the clusters to see, well, what could we or should we be aspiring to? So that's my third little sort of challenge and comment out there. But less from me. We have this report. We have the two authors sitting beside us. So if I may, I'd like to turn to, do I turn to Paul first of all?
Kick off, yeah. So
I'll turn to Paul to kick off on the review and the extent to which it's working, the extent to which there are some fluffy alternatives.